Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back into a time when fruit wasn't just food. It was theatre. You're walking down a rain-slick cobblestone lane in 17th century Amsterdam, boots clicking softly. Gas lamps flicker against canal waters. Somewhere in a grand canal house behind lace-curtained windows, a party is underway. Music, laughter, the clink of gold-rimmed goblets. And on the table, a single pineapple, gleaming. Aloof, untouched. You're not hallucinating. That fruit is the night's main event. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's be clear right away. You probably wouldn't survive the Dutch Golden Age. Unless you're fluent in maritime trade law, know how to politely duel someone over a tapestry, and can balance powdered sugar wigs while drunk on clove wine. But tonight, you don't need any of that. You just need to imagine the smell of beeswax candles, strict codes, the shuffle of velvet shoes, and the slow, silent drama of a pineapple arriving at a party. The Dutch Golden Age, roughly the 1600s, is an era of overwhelming success. Holland is buzzing with merchant wealth, scientific discovery, and that peculiar energy that comes when a small country suddenly starts acting like the center of the universe. Everything's for sale. Everything's improving. And everyone's watching everyone else to make sure they don't fall behind. Enter the pineapple. A ridiculous-looking, thorny, sweet-smelling fruit from faraway places. So exotic it might as well be a unicorn horn dipped in sugar. The first time most Dutch folks lay eyes on one, it's not in a market. It's in a painting, which makes sense, because that's where pineapples lived most of the timing in dreams, on canvases, or on rented pedestals at upper-class parties. Your host tonight, let's call her Magdalena, has just acquired one. She didn't buy it, of course. That would be absurd. She's renting it, for a single evening, from a man who specializes in rare fruit display services. Yes, that's a thing. He arrives at the door like a florist or a magician's assistant. The fruit is wrapped in silk. It smells like sunshine and something slightly fermented. The butler nods and carefully places it on the walnut buffet table, surrounded by wax fruit and gold candlesticks. Guests begin to gather. It's not just a fruit. It's a conversation starter, a centerpiece, a symbol that Magdalena's husband, who made a killing shipping nutmeg from Java, is doing quite well, thank you. The pineapple is positioned at eye level, lit from above, and you better believe no one's allowed to touch it. Now, here's the awkward part: nobody knows what it actually tastes like. A few folks, usually well-traveled sailors or wealthy importers, claim to have tried it, but the descriptions vary wildly. One point compared it to honey melting on iron. Another said it was like eating a sunburned rose. You'd ask for clarification, but they're already arguing about it. At this point, you might be wondering why not just buy the thing and eat it. Because that's not the point. Owning a pineapple was like owning the moon. You didn't eat it. You exhibited it. Eating it would be like driving a racehorse off a cliff just to prove you could. Wasteful, unthinkable, and also slightly tragic. Pineapples, you see, had traveled thousands of miles to get here. They were grown in blistering heat on plantations in the Caribbean or Brazil, picked before ripeness, hauled across oceans in dark ship holds, stored next to rum barrels and ropes, constantly at risk of rotting or being stolen. Some didn't survive. The ones that did were minor miracles. By the time they reached the Dutch ports of Amsterdam or Rotterdam, they were fragrant, browning, and worth more than a year's rent. You think avocados are expensive? Try a pineapple that costs more than your cousin's wedding. Historians still argue whether the pineapple craze began as a genuine fascination with foreign flavors, or if it was all just an elaborate upper-class performance. After all, not everyone was charmed. One 17th century scholar dismissed the pineapple as a loud fruit, all appearance and no practicality. Another suggested it was God's joke on wealthy men with poor digestion. But that didn't stop the obsession. You picture Magdalena's guests crowding around the display table. A woman fans herself and says she's heard the fruit can cure melancholy. A man in peacock blue breeches nods solemnly and declares it helped his gout. Someone suggests carving a tiny slice for a priest, but the host shakes her head. She doesn't want to invalidate the rental agreement, which, yes, included strict no-bite clauses. You break it, you buy it, strict codes. What's even stranger is there's a waiting list. Pineapples make the rounds like prized pets. After Magdalena's party, the same fruit will appear in a banker's birthday tableau, then maybe in a painter's still life commission, then perhaps as the star attraction in a shipping magnate's daughter's wedding. At some point, it will rot beyond saving. At that point, some renters pivot and use it in perfume. Others just lacquer it and keep it as a shriveled conversation piece. You've got to admire the hustle. There's something both absurd and beautiful about a society that turns a perishable fruit into a cultural event. And you're just getting started. You wander from Magdalena's canal house back out into the night, still thinking about that pineapple. Unbitten, adored, worth more than a gold chalice. The whole thing feels surreal. But here's the thing, in 17th century Holland, it wasn't unusual. In fact, it was a symptom of something bigger. Much bigger. The Dutch Golden Age wasn't just a period of national pride. It was an era of controlled, competitive peacocking. You lived under layers of status, strict codes woven tighter than the lace collars around your neck. Every item you owned, your furniture, your paintings, your spoons, was silently broadcasting your position in the social food chain, and pineapples screamed. This was the same century when tulips had caused economic whiplash. Remember tulip mania? Yeah, that short period when people sold houses to buy a single bulb. The Dutch weren't strangers to over-investing in plants, but where tulips were speculation, pineapples were status. Clear, solid, showy, no waiting for blooms, no squinting to see if it was right varietal. You knew instantly if someone had pineapple money. And it wasn't just pineapples. The Dutch Golden Age was a buffet of luxuries, many of them borrowed or outright stolen from abroad. Sugar, Cloves porcelain, silks, cacao. If it was rare, beautiful, or smelled vaguely like paradise, the Dutch East India Company probably had it in stock. Their reach was wild, strict codes. These weren't your garden variety merchants with carts and jingling coins. These were corporate warlords with fleets. The VOC, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, was the world's first multinational corporation, and it operated like a cross between Amazon, the British Navy, and a Bond villain. They had ships with cannons, administrators who took notes in 7 languages, and warehouses in every useful port from Jakarta to Cape Town. Pineapples hitched rides on those ships. Not intentionally at first. They weren't export crops. But a few sailors, charmed by their weird armor and candy smell, tried smuggling them back. And once word got around that a fruit could make you more interesting at dinner parties than an entire education in theology, demand surged. The problem: pineapples hate boats. Unlike, say, cloves, which can dry quietly in a sack, pineapples need constant care. They ripen fast, rot faster, and react poorly to damp sea holds. They're the divas of the fruit world. Getting one to survive a voyage across the Atlantic was a logistical nightmare. But the Dutch were problem solvers. If anyone could outwit biology, it was them. And so, the pineapple arms race began. Ship captains began creating pineapple cradles, little hammock-like devices suspended from beams to keep the fruit cushioned and aired. Some merchants insisted on transporting them in barrels of dry rice to soak up moisture and keep things from bruising. Others packed them in straw and whispered desperate prayers to St. Nicholas, patron of sailors and gift-bearing logistics. Historians still debate whether most pineapples actually made it intact, or whether many were carefully reconstructed from semi-rotten remains, much like overly confident souffles. Some travelers' journals describe pineapples with noble mold upon them, which is probably the most diplomatic way to say, "This fruit is dying but still photogenic." And once they did arrive, a whole chain of industry sprang up around their presence. You had fruit delivery specialists, pineapple carvers for wax replicas, artists who specialized in fruit portraiture, cabinet makers crafting pineapple-specific pedestals, party planners with pineapple-themed events. Yes, pineapple events. Imagine themed minas, gold leaf place cards, and dried pineapple skin repurposed as potpourri. If someone ever handed you a pineapple-scented calling card, you were officially dealing with a person who had forgotten what modesty was. You pause to imagine your own pineapple moment. Let's say you're a minor civil servant who's finally saved enough to rent one. You invite colleagues. You polish the windows. You buy a new tablecloth. When the fruit arrives, you handle it like a newborn. You don't just display it. You give a speech. You write a poem. You try, very gently, to sketch it yourself before the fruit guy takes it back. And when your party's over, you swear you still smell it for days. Maybe you do. Or maybe you're just trying to stretch the magic. One forgotten fact in all this is that pineapples weren't always displayed whole. In some cases, slices were served, but only the outer ring. The core was too coarse. That outer ring, when cut thin, looked like golden stained glass. That's what you'd get if you were really important. But mostly, the fruit remained untouched, like a relic. In that sense, it wasn't food. It was theater, a performance, a symbol of human mastery over nature and geography. And the pineapple wasn't alone. Other fruits got brief turns in the limelight. Mangoes, papayas, even bananas made appearances. But nothing beat the drama of a pineapple. That crown, that armor, that perfume. It was nature's Fabergé egg. Of course, not everyone was enchanted. There were pamphlets and sermons warning against tropical fruit idolatry. One preacher accused the pineapple of promoting gluttony through scent. Which, let's be honest, sounds like a very polite 1600s way of saying, you people need to calm down. Still, the obsession persisted. You couldn't grow them in Europe? Not yet. And that scarcity kept them precious. Which brings us to one of the oddest side effects of pineapple fever, the explosion in fake pineapples. Yes, fakes, papier-mâché replicas, wax sculptures, painted decoys. Some were so convincing, strict codes. Guests would leave parties still believing they'd seen the real thing. It's like the social equivalent of hiring someone to play piano behind a curtain and telling everyone it's your cousin. By now, you've figured it out. The pineapple was less about the taste and more about the tale. It's saying I am worldly, I am connected, I am absurdly, recklessly successful. And everyone in the room believed it, until the fruit began to sag. You're beginning to notice a pattern, right? The pineapple wasn't a fruit. It was a social performance in one prickly, fragrant package. And like all good performances, it came with rules, stagecraft, and the ever-present fear of messing it up. Let's say you're a moderately wealth burger in Amsterdam around 1680. You've got a good reputation, a steady flow of trade income, and a decent collection of Delft tiles. But you're not nobility. You don't get invited to the best salons. And then one day, you'll hear it. Your neighbor, Hendrik with the suspiciously nice curtains, just hosted a soiree with a pineapple centerpiece. Everyone's talking about it. So what do? You get on a list. There were, believe it or not, rental services. Discreet, exclusive networks where you could pay a premium to borrow a pineapple for a day. No nibbling, no slicing. Just display. Like renting a crown for an evening. You'd sign a contract, pledge to guard the fruit like it was a diplomat, and then, with trembling hands, you'd unveil it at your gathering. And the crowd would gasp. Some records suggest that a single pineapple could change hands a dozen times before it finally went soft. Its value didn't diminish with each display. It increased. That fruit had a social ransom, if it had already appeared at the mayor's house. Even better. It was like getting a book signed by increasingly important readers. Of course, you had to return it quickly. No one wanted to be the guy who ruined 1,000 guilder pineapple because he left it near the fireplace. One merchant's journal even records a fruit emergency, where a courier was dispatched mid-party to exchange a ripening pineapple for a fresher decoy. Crisis averted. Historians still argue whether these rentals were truly widespread, or if they were an elite affectation magnified by gossip, but the idea persists in records, artwork, and household inventories, suggesting there was at least a brief moment when fruit rental was as normal as hiring a harpist. Codes. You reach the part of the city where the canal widens, and for a moment, you imagine standing at one of those grand windows, candlelight catching the pineapple's golden skin, guests lingering near it, unsure whether to admire or avert their eyes. And oh, the etiquette. If you were a guest at one of these affairs, you didn't touch the pineapple. Definitely didn't smell it up close. You admired it from a safe distance, offered exaggerated compliments, and perhaps, if you were bold, asked the host how he managed to secure such a fine specimen. You did not ask if it was real. That would have been like asking if the silverware was actually silver. Very uncouth. Instead, you listened to stories. Every pineapple had one. Some were wild. This one travelled in a box lined with silk. Or it was escorted by a cabin boy who sang to it every morning. Others were more mystical. It ripened under the equator during a solar eclipse. Or a priest blessed it in a port chapel before shipment. And the guests would nod, eyes wide, playing along because that was the fun of it. No one wanted to break the spell. But here's a twist. Not everyone who rented pineapples was doing it to show off. Some were, oddly enough, scientists. You turn a corner, and just ahead, a modest building with ivy creeping over the lintels. It's one of those early academies. Private, smoky, half museum, half lab. Inside, a few natural philosophers are hunched over magnifying glasses and pewter scales. To them, the pineapple wasn't a trophy. It was a puzzle. How did it grow in such strange symmetry? Why did its skin form hexagons? Was it a fruit or a flower? Some scholars thought it held secrets to the divine geometry of creation. In fact, one famous Dutch naturalist, Jan Commelin, devoted nearly a decade to studying exotic plants in the Hortus Botanicus of Amsterdam. When he finally got his hands on a viable pineapple, he treated it like a holy relic. Sketches, dissections, journals. It was practically a botanical crime scene. He even tried to grow his own using careful cuttings, though progress was slow. And still, even in these sober studies, there was a touch of awe. Pineapples were weird. Too beautiful, too symmetrical, too fragrant to be normal. Some even believed they were proof of God's indulgent side. The botanical equivalent of a dessert cart in Genesis. That's how tangled the pineapple had become. It wasn't just a fruit. It was a story, a science project, a social experiment. Back at your imagined party, you pour another glass of wine and glance at the pineapple. It's a little dimmer under the candlelight now. Maybe the room's just smoky, or maybe the fruit's starting to tire. But for tonight, it still holds. And in that moment, you understand something. It's not about ownership. It's about illusion. The pineapple is a rented dream. A reminder that status is often borrowed, paraded, and then returned with as much dignity as one can muster. Which, now that you think about it, is a very Dutch attitude. Practicality wrapped in performance. Luxury on a leash. You wake slowly, or at least that's how it feels. One moment you're sipping imaginary wine at a 17th century canal house party, basking in the silent glamour of a rented pineapple. And the next, you're drifting through the early morning streets of Amsterdam. The fog clings low. Narrow houses lean like tipsy old friends above the cobbled alleys. Everything smells faintly of damp stone, peat smoke, and just a touch of yesterday's herring. You pause near a market square where a few stall-keepers are setting up crates and baskets. No pineapples here? Not yet, anyway. But apples? Sure. Cabbage? Everywhere. And that, right there, is what makes the whole pineapple frenzy so strange. Because the Dutch weren't exactly starved for fruit. In fact, the Dutch Golden Age was a time of agricultural richness. Pears, plums, cherries. They all thrived in the temperate climate, with expert gardeners and clever canal irrigation keeping things blooming beautifully. Yet somehow they craved the foreign. Here's a fact that helps frame things. By the mid-1600s, the Dutch had the largest merchant fleet in the world. Over 16,000 ships were crisscrossing oceans, bringing home goods and ideas from every imaginable port: spices, silk, porcelain, parrots, and yes, fruit. One merchant wrote that every ship from Suriname or Batavia carried a piece of paradise, which was poetic code for tropical goods that couldn't be grown at home. That phrase caught on. Soon, exotic fruit wasn't just produce, it was paradise on a plate. And the pineapple. It was the ambassador. Strict codes. You walk past a print shop where the latest broadsheets are being hawked. If you had the time to leaf through them, you might see a woodcut of a man holding what looks like a spiky hand grenade. A pineapple, yes, but depicted with the reverence of a saint's relic. The caption might call it Den Koning van Fruit, the king of fruit. That name stuck. In art, literature, and even architecture. Some canal homes were decorated with pineapple-shaped finials or door knockers, just in case you needed a reminder that status lived here. What's more curious is how the pineapple became a motif not just of wealth, but welcome. Some historians trace this symbolism to seafaring traditions, where sailors, returning home, would impale a pineapple on a gatepost as a sign they'd returned safely and were ready to entertain. Whether or not this was widespread in the Netherlands is debated, but the idea of pineapple as hospitality took root. So now imagine you're not just a fruit fancier or a gossip-prone socialite. You're a merchant's wife preparing for a homecoming feast. You light beeswax candles. You fluff the embroidered cushions. And when the guests arrive, there on the sideboard is the pineapple, scented, elevated, almost glowing. It doesn't matter that it costs as much as a small cow. It doesn't even matter that no one's going to eat it. What matters is the gesture. You're offering your guests a symbol that says, I spared no expense to honor your presence. Even if the pineapple itself was a rental, strict codes. But let's pause here and let the absurdity fully ripen. Because pineapples were so expensive and rare that it wasn't uncommon to find pineapple replicas. Made of wax, papier-mâché, even painted wood. These were fakes with flair. They'd be tucked into fruit bowls or placed atop tall platters, flanked by real grapes and apples to distract from the forgery. It was, in essence, the first known case of Instagram versus reality. There's a pamphlet, somewhat satirical, from 1692 that mocks a household for passing off a fake pineapple at a dinner party. The guests are described as leaning in, eyes moist with wonder, pretending not to smell the varnish. It's funny, sure, but also telling. Strict codes. Because the social risk of faking opulence could backfire just as dramatically as overspending on the real thing. Historians still argue whether these forgeries were meant as practical stand-ins or cheeky social critiques. Some say they were decoys to deter theft. Others think they were just part of the performance. Props in the theatre of status. Meanwhile, back at the docks, a real pineapple arrives in a wooden crate cushioned with hay and dried herbs. It's tagged with a hand, scrawled label voor de heer van Houtkoop. Strict codes. The merchant it's addressed to won't display it until Sunday. That's when his rivals will be over for brandy, and he'll, casually, mention that his pineapple was sourced from a new plantation where the climate makes them sweeter. And now you're starting to see how layered this obsession became. It wasn't just the fruit. It was the story behind the fruit. The origin, the journey, the exclusive source. Pineapples became like vintage wines. Terroir mattered, even if no one fully understood what that meant. In that way, the Dutch pineapple craze wasn't all that different from today's coffee culture. You know the type. Single origin. Hand-roasted. Notes of elderflower and roasted pinecone. It's not just about the taste. It's about the narrative. One curious tidbitting: there were attempts, strict codes, even during the peak of pineapple mania, to artificially perfume other fruits to smell like pineapple. One failed experiment involved simmering pear peels with imported oils and then rubbing them on the surface of melons. The results, apparently, were disturbing to the senses. Still, the effort tells you something people wanted the idea of pineapple as much as the pineapple itself. And you, standing now at the edge of a courtyard where a servant sweeps leaves into a perfect spiral, start to wonder. Was this obsession ever truly about taste? After all, most people never got to bite into one. Many who did found the flavored fine, pleasant, a bit strange, juicy sure, but certainly not worth a week's wages. But they kept chasing it anyway, because in that fruit was a fantasy, one you could carry in your hands, or fake on your sideboard, or whisper about at markets, long after it had spoiled and been tossed into the canal. You're back on the move now, strolling along a quiet canal whose surface mirrors the faint blush of morning. The water is still except for the occasional ripple of a duck, strict codes, which honks at you like it's personally offended you didn't bring breadcrumbs. A man pedals by on a rattly cart stuffed with empty crates, likely returning from delivering something precious. Not pineapples, though. That kind of treasure gets its own special escort. Speaking of treasure, let's take a closer look at the Dutch themselves. The merchants, the mariners, strict codes, the upper crust of Amsterdam's pineapple elite. Who were these people throwing their guilders at fruit-shaped status symbols? The Dutch Republic in the 17th century was booming. Trade, finance, science, art. It was like someone had hit the cultural jackpot and kept winning. Amsterdam was Europe's wealthiest city, home to the first stock exchange, pioneering banks, and an exploding middle class that was, for the first time, aspirational. And with that aspiration came, overcompensation. See, this wasn't the old-school nobility with inherited castles and dusty coats of arms. These were self-made men. Merchants, investors. Men who'd spent years on rough seas or poring over ledgers by candlelight. Their money was new, and their status was, how to put it, fragile. So what do you when you want to prove you're someone? You start showing it. Loudly. Obsessively. Fruity lie. Homes became stages. Furniture got fancier. Portraits grew more elaborate, especially those still-life paintings. You know the ones. A table piled with oysters, peeled lemons, silver goblets tipped just so, and center stage, a pineapple, probably borrowed, possibly fake, definitely the visual equivalent of shouting. Look how far I've come. Historians still debate whether these paintings were meant to critique excess or celebrate it. Some say they're quiet warnings about vanity and fleeting pleasure. Others think they're just delicious visual flexes. But in either case, they reflect a society obsessed with image. And what better image than a pineapple whose prickly exterior hides an exotic heart? You pause at the window of an artist's studio. Inside, a canvas stands half-finished head, a merchant family in starched collars posing with their children, and there it is. A pineapple on the table, resting in a bowl like a precious orb. The artist dabs at the leaves with green ochre. He's not painting a fruit. He's painting a reputation. Here's a strange but true detail. Some households would hire an artist to paint their pineapple before it spoiled. That's how rare they were. You couldn't just pop one in the fridge. No, you had maybe 3 days of peak glamour before it turned to mush. So what do? Immortalize it. Some of these pineapple portraits still survive in Dutch museums today, often mislabeled as fruit studies. But look closer, and you'll notice how out of place the pineapple looks, surrounded by apples and cheese wheels and the occasional live parrot. One painting even shows a toddler holding a pineapple like it's a toy, which, if you've ever tried to hold a pineapple, sounds like an emergency room visit waiting to happen. But again, it's not about realism. It's about fantasy, strict codes. You wander past a baker's stall where a tray of cinnamon rolls sends sweet steam into the air. You're tempted, but your eyes catch a curious object just beyond. A ceramic pineapple, glazed in bright yellows, slightly chipped at the crown. Someone tried to replicate the real thing, and in doing so, made it strangely cuter. These ceramic pineapples were a thing too. Dutch potters, especially in Delft, began producing porcelain pineapple models, not just for decoration, but for function. Some were hollow containers. Others were candle holders. A few were salt cellars. Because why not sprinkle your herring with salt poured from a tiny pineapple? It all feels so specific, so absurd, so human. And yet, not everyone was buying in, literally or figuratively. Pamphlets began circulating warning of the fruit plague among the wealthy. One anonymous writer described a pineapple as a tyrant of taste, devouring reason and coin alike. Dramatic, sure, but not entirely wrong. One fringe theory even suggested that exposure to pineapples could cause moral decay, that their foreignness corrupted the soul. Of course, this was also tied up with colonial anxiety and fear of change, a classic cocktail of moral panic, now with 100% more vitamin C. But that anxiety didn't stop the trend. If anything, it made pineapples even more alluring. They weren't just tasty, they were taboo. Another oddity, some people began commissioning pineapple-themed jewelry. Lockets shaped like pineapples. Brooches with tiny spiked crowns. Even rings etched with pineapple motifs. Imagine sliding a glimmering golden fruit onto your finger just to say, "I know a guy who knows a captain." You're beginning to see just how deep this fruit-fueled rabbit hole goes. As you round a corner into a quieter alley, you pass a tailor's shop where a fabric bolt hangs from a window. It's printed with swirling leaves and what looks like, yes, pineapples. Stylized, sure, but definitely there. A design imported from India, modified in the Dutch Indies, and now here, woven into the clothes of status seekers and summer gowns alike. And just when you think this can't possibly get more absurd, you remember this: people once rented pineapples just to take them on a stroll. That's right. They'd hire a servant to carry the fruit in a special sling or velvet case, walking beside them as they paraded through markets and gardens. It was part handbag, part hype man. Oh, this old thing. Just a tropical delicacy I borrowed for the day. No one ate it. No one touched it. The pineapple was a companion piece. Strict codes. It's hard to say whether this practice was widespread or exaggerated by gossipy rivals, but the accounts do exist. And if even one person paid to stroll a pineapple through a public square just for attention, that tells you everything you need to know. And so, as you lean against a railing overlooking a sleepy canal, the whole world feels briefly ridiculous. Elegant, yes. Prosperous, undeniably. But also deeply silly. People chasing meaning in produce. Renting status. Buying fruit they couldn't eat to impress people they barely liked. But don't judge too quickly, because centuries later, we're still doing it. Only now, it's influencers with borrowed handbags, or coffee table books no one reads, or phone cameras aimed at avocado toast that's gone cold. The pineapple may have changed shape, but the obsession, still deliciously familiar. You linger there a moment longer, watching as the water below reflects the first hints of afternoon sun. A boat glides past, quiet as a whisper, and you can almost imagine a crate on board, swaddled in cloth, guarded like treasure, carrying its precious cargo of pineapples to someone's canal-side mansion. Because by now, you've learned that the real excitement wasn't just owning a pineapple, it was getting one. The supply chain behind this fruity obsession, strict codes, it was absolutely bonkers. Let's start in the Caribbean. That's where most of Europe's pineapples came from, especially in the 17th century. Places like Suriname, under Dutch control, or the broader West Indies. Warm, humid, sticky places. Perfect for growing this stubbornly high-maintenance fruit. You probably don't think of pineapples as fussy, but they are. They take 18 to 24 months to reach full maturity, and even then, they bruise easily, rot quickly, and hate the cold. Which is unfortunate when your destination is the North Sea. So how did they do it? With grit, creativity, and a lot of crushed dreams along the way. The first trick was picking them just before full ripeness. Early enough to survive the voyage, late enough to still look impressive when they arrived. Then came the packing process. Pineapples were wrapped in straw, bundled in crates, and stored in the dreest, most temperature, stable part of the ship. Some captains even gave them their own storage space. Above grain, away from livestock, shielded from damp. Not quite first class, but pretty posh for fruit. And still, most shipments spoiled. That's why each successful delivery was a miniature miracle. Out of a crate of 20, maybe 5 would arrive intact. Maybe 2 would still look glamorous enough for display. That scarcity just jacked the prices even higher. Historians still argue whether the bulk of pineapples actually came in by ship or whether many were failed imports substituted with fakes. Clay models, wax replicas, even spiky gourds dyed yellow to pass as pineapples. It's possible that a huge chunk of this market was built on illusion, and nobody wanted to be the one to call it out. Because how do you accuse your host of flaunting a fraudulent fruit? You'd be calling them a liar and a bad shopper. That's social suicide in satin breeches. One story, possibly apocryphal, possibly not, involves a Dutch governor who received a single pineapple at port and threw a lavish party just to unveil it. But when the fruit was revealed from its velvet wrappings, it was clearly moldy. Did he cancel the event? No. He served pineapple-shaped marzipan instead, passed it off as the delicacy of the future, and walked away with applause. F's for improvisation. F for refrigeration. Of course, there were other solutions for those who wanted pineapples without fruit roulette on the high seas. Entering the hothouse pineapple. Yes, you heard that right. The Dutch were among the first Europeans to try and grow pineapples at home using early greenhouse technology. Orangeries already used to coddle citrus trees were retrofitted into pineapple palaces. But this wasn't gardening. This was engineering. A proper Dutch pineapple hothouse needed layers of glass, underground heating systems fueled by horse manure, glamorous, and an obsessive gardener to monitor humidity, light, and temperature by the hour. Strict codes. Some designs even included angled mirrors to direct sunlight more efficiently onto the fruit's base. Imagine growing one pineapple over 2 years indoors with a team of laborers just to maybe eat it once. One surviving Dutch blueprint from the late 1600s shows a greenhouse plan with individual plant stalls, like horse stables. But for pineapples, each fruit with its own dedicated nook. You almost expect them to have names, probably something pompous, like Sir Prickles III. And still, despite all this effort, the yield was laughable. 1 pineapple every few years, if you were lucky. If not, you were left with an expensive pile of compost and some questionable life choices. But here's the kicker: people kept doing it. Because growing your own pineapple wasn't just agricultural ambition. It was the ultimate status flex. Think about it. Any wealthy merchant could buy a pineapple. But growing one, that meant knowledge, patience, innovation. You weren't just rich. You were a visionary. This was especially true for members of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. Many of them returned home after years abroad with botanical obsessions. Some brought back pineapple seeds. Others brought cuttings. A few brought entire pineapple crowns tucked into their personal effects, risking fines and fungi just for the chance to grow tropical dreams in grey-skied Holland. One particularly intense fellow, whose name is lost to history, supposedly constructed a glass, domed pineapple nursery in the middle of his formal garden. Visitors weren't allowed to touch anything, not the plants, not the soil, not even the gardener. The whole place was treated like a temple, a fruit temple. Some joke that these men were less horticulturalists and more pineapple cultists. And, well, the shoe kind of fits. You continue your walk through a quieter district now, where the canals thin into smaller tributaries and the buildings lean in just slightly, like old friends whispering secrets. In a dusty shop window, you spot a curious artifact in a hand-painted tile featuring a pineapple cradled by 2 winged cherubs. Above them, in calligraphic vertus, in fruit. Strength in fruit. Okay, that's not an official motto, but it should be. Because that's what pineapples symbolized. Wealth, worldliness, wits. The kind of fruit that separated the merely successful from the cosmically envied. One final twist for today sometimes. The pineapple wasn't even meant to be eaten at all. It was passed from host to host, party to party, as a shared display piece. Strict codes. The same pineapple could make the rounds for weeks, growing riper and smellier with each event. Until finally, when the last reveler had gawked at its shrinking crown, it was quietly disposed of. No one wanted to be the one to cut it, because to eat meant ending the fantasy. You glanced down at your hands, imagining them cradling such a fruit. Heavy, warm from the hothouse, smelling of distant lands and fermented sugar. Something you carry not to consume, but to remember. In this world of gilded craving and delicate illusion, a pineapple wasn't a snack, it was a story. You step away from that dusty tile and wander farther down the cobbled lane. The echo of your footsteps mingling with the gentle creak of shutters and the slap of a rope against mast in the nearby harbour. The whole city seems to breathe slower here, as if even time has taken a moment to fan itself and marvel at the absurd elegance of 17th century fruit. Because now, we arrive at one of the most deliciously bizarre aspects of this whole pineapple affair, the rental. Yes, in Dutch Golden Age society, you didn't need to own a pineapple to enjoy its benefits. You could simply borrow one. For a fee, of course. Picture you're a well-to-do merchant's wife planning a sari. The menu is sorted. The musicians are booked. Your new velvet gown is dyed with imported indigo. And the dining room candles are all hand-dipped beeswax, none of that lard-based nonsense. But something's missing. The centerpiece, that jaw-dropping, envy-inducing touch that makes your guests gasp as they remove their gloves. Enter the pineapple rental man. Yes, there were actual brokers who kept pineapples in controlled conditions and offered them out by the day, even by the hour. You paid a premium to have one sit, resplendent and untouched, on your table during your dinner. A few flowers might be arranged around it. Perhaps a ribbon. Maybe it was placed on a small pedestal, like an edible deity. Then, after the party, it was discreetly packed up, carted away, and rented again to the next host. Strict codes. It's essentially the medieval version of staging a home with fake furniture. Only much stickier. One cheeky report from a Dutch household ledger notes an ananas voor vertoon. Pineapple for display, listed under entertainment expenses. Price just under the cost of hiring a string quartet. Priorities, clearly. Some pineapples were so well-travelled they became minor celebrities in their own right. Whispers of, "Did you see the Van Dyck pineapple at last week's engagement dinner?" fluttered through salons and shops like scandalous gossip. A particularly symmetrical one could make the rounds for weeks before succumbing to rot, by which point its aroma was more barnyard than bouquet. And yes, if a pineapple started to turn during your party, if its surface collapsed or it gave off a suspiciously fermented perfume, you were expected to play it cool, light another candle, bring out the lavender sachets, never let them see you sweat. Historians still debate whether these pineapple rentals were ever officially regulated. Some believe there was a guild, or at least a gentleman's agreement, about who could offer rental fruit and what condition it needed to be in. Others argue it was more informal, a back-room service among grocers and elite households, whispered about behind curtains but never openly advertised. What's clearer is that the rental system cemented the pineapple's role as pure symbol. You didn't even need to eat it anymore. You just needed to be seen with it. And isn't that relatable? Like wearing designer shoes you can't walk in, or taking selfies with a borrowed yacht. Some things exist not to serve, but to signal. In fact, some Dutch artists began painting pineapples into portraits of people who couldn't possibly afford the real thing. A still life here, a carved fruit bowl there. It was aspirational art, like a 17th century vision board. Surround yourself with images of success, and maybe it'll rub off. One painting, attributed to a minor student of Rembrandt, depicts a young woman in a modest lace collar holding a pineapple like an infant. Her eyes are downcast, her hands reverent. The fruit glows with golden hues, center stage stealing the spotlight from its human counterpart. The painting was probably commissioned as a marriage gift, meant to suggest the bride's future prosperity. A pineapple as dowry. Imagine that conversation with your future in-laws, and it wasn't just homes and portraits. Pineapple motifs infiltrated every corner of domestic design. Delft tiles with their spiky silhouettes, embroidered napkins, ceramic fruit bowls made purely to hold imaginary pineapples. They popped up in wedding china, even ceiling carvings, even etched into silver snuff boxes. You pass one such antique shop now, its windows hazy with age, and spot a brass pineapple-shaped door knocker. A relic, yes, but also a quiet scream of, "I once had taste," and connections, and fruit-shaped ambition. Even the architecture joined the trend. One surviving merchant home in Leiden boasts a pineapple finial on its rooftop gable, a literal crown of fruit surveying the city skyline. Was it added for fashion? Or was it a coded wink from one fruit fancying family to another? You'll never know. But that's part of the fun, because the pineapple wasn't just rare, it was mysterious, exotic, foreign, a fruit from a world that most Dutch citizens would never visit, yet felt they somehow understood through its scent and shape. That yearning, owning a symbol of somewhere far away, fed directly into the booming culture of curiosity cabinets and travel collections. Pineapples went out of place among shells, feathers, shrunken heads, and maps of sea monsters. They were both agricultural specimen and dream fuel. One wealthy gentleman even mounted a dried pineapple under glass and displayed it with a plaque reading, "Specimen of the New World, 1689. No mention of whether it had ever been eaten. Probably not. The past had better restraint than we do. And if you're wondering, yes, some people eventually try to capitalize on this craze by making pineapple perfume. These concoctions, often derived from fermented peel and citrus oils, claim to capture the fruit's sweet, tart aroma in a bottle. Reviews reap mixed. One satirical pamphlet joked that the perfume smelled like a pirate's sock after a tropical holiday. Harsh, but fair. You pause near a bridge now, leaning on its smooth stone rail. The sun is dipping lower, brushing the rooftops with a kind of golden glow that would make a pineapple blush. There's a breeze picking up, carrying the scent of river silt and roasted almonds from a nearby cart. And for just a moment, you imagine holding that fruit again, heavier than it looks, spickier, sticky around the base from just the idea of ripeness. Not yours, not to taste, but to show. Because in this city of clever commerce and careful illusion, ownership is temporary. But prestige, that can be rented. You step off the bridge with the image of that pineapple still ghosting your hands, cold and sticky and strange. The scent of roasted almonds follows you for a block or two, until it fades behind the clatter of wooden carts and the creak of a fishmonger's stall being closed for the evening. Now, let's shift the lens a little. If we've been hovering around the edges of polite Dutch society, peering in through lace curtains and dodging snide party whispers, it's time to dig into the real engine behind this fruity frenzy, the merchant class. Because while pineapples may have sat on golden platters and in gloved hands, their journey to the Dutch Republic began in far grimmer places: tropical sweat, cargo holds, trade winds, and of course, colonial ambition. In the 17th century, the Dutch East and West India Companies were not just trade organizations, they were nation-states in miniature. Armed with ships, private armies, and enough bureaucratic paperwork to humble any modern DMV, they carved up the globe in search of spices, sugar, tobacco, and eventually fruit. The pineapple, native to South America, had already waves in Europe thanks to Spanish and Portuguese exploration. But the Dutch, ever shred and hungry for status, were determined to outdo their Iberian rivals. They couldn't just import pineapples. No, they wanted to control them. Strict codes. So began the complicated colonial experiment of growing pineapples in foreign soil, and then shipping them halfway across the world. You imagine a ship's hold in 1662 dim, damp, and rank with mold. Casks of rum sloshed gently beside stacks of sugar, barrels of indigo, and, wrapped carefully in straw or nestled in wooden crates, pineapples, each one a time bomb of ripening. Too early, and it's tart and green. Too late, and it liquefies in its own skin. The perfect shipping window. About 3 days, on a voyage that could take 3 months. So how did any of them arrive at all? Answer: most didn't. But those that did became near miraculous. Survivors of wind and wave, prized like jewels upon landing. A single ripe pineapple, fresh off the dock, and smelling faintly of the equator, could sell for the price of a modest sailboat. And sometimes, the very fact that it made it was enough. A few noble households displayed their pineapples like trophies and never ate them. When the fruit finally turned, it was ceremonially buried in the garden. One diary from a wealthy merchant's daughter describes the event like a funeral. The fruit was interred near the hydrangeas. Mother wore lilac. Historians still argue whether most pineapples were shipped ripe or green. Some sources suggest early harvesting and slow ripening under straw during the voyage. Others point to chemical tricks, dips in lime water or honey wax, to delay spoilage. Either way, it was a gamble. An edible lottery with high odds and even higher stakes. That's why some entrepreneurial Dutch growers began experimenting with growing pineapples at home. Not in the streets of Amsterdam, of course, but in private estates just outside the city. And thus, the pineapple house was born, also called ananas kassen. These were early greenhouses, walled structures made of brick and glass, angled to catch the sun, heated by coal stoves or buried manure pits. Imagine a small, steamy conservatory filled with thick tropical leaves and the occasional glint of a golden fruit. The air humid and earthy, the smell somewhere between sugarcane and compost. It was high maintenance, labor-intensive, and wildly inefficient. But if you pulled it off, you had pineapple power. One gentleman reportedly grew a pineapple in Harlem and hand-delivered it to a visiting Swedish ambassador. The fruit had its own litter and was carried by 2 servants in matching cloaks. The ambassador, not to be outdone, sent back a ship full of pickled herring, which honestly feels on brand. Another estate tried to create pineapple maze, a winding garden of hedges and hothouses where guests could stumble upon the rare fruit as if by accident. Subtlety was not their strong suit. By now, you're picturing these pineapple growers as eccentric aristocrats with far too much time and manure on their hands. And that's not entirely wrong. But some were serious horticulturalists, early scientists even, who kept obsessive journals on temperature, soil type, and watering schedules. They crossbred species, experimented with pollination, and debated whether music helped the fruit grow faster. Spoiler, it didn't. One grower even composed a short sonata called Ode to Ananas, played nightly on the lute beside his greenhouse. His neighbors complained about the sound and the smell. These early pineapple houses were the forerunners of much larger glass structures that would one day revolutionize European agriculture. But at the time, they were status symbols with thermometers. Owning one said, "I can grow something that dies everywhere else. And I have the help to do it." Yet not everyone was a fan of this horticultural vanity. A satire printed in The Hague featured a cartoon of a nobleman spooning dirt into his own ears, with the caption, "May he hear what his fruit says of him." Which, to be fair, is quite the burn. You duck into a quieter alley now, where the air is cooler and smells of soap and lemon peel. Someone's doing laundry nearby. You hear water dripping from a pipe and the muffled sound of singing. Something old and rhythmic. Maybe a lullaby. Maybe a work tune. And you think about all the hands that touched those pineapples before they ever made it to porcelain plates and oil paintings. The sailors who guarded them from rats, the laborers who hauled them, the gardeners who coaxed them from unfamiliar soil. The cost wasn't just gold, it was time, labor, obsession, and of quiet madness that made fruit into fantasy. The singing fades as you turn another corner, and your feet tap gently against the uneven stones of a city still unwinding from its golden century. The streets are calmer now. Lanterns sway in doorways. Somewhere, a dog lets out a lazy yawn of a bark. But your mind is still tangled in vines and greenhouse glass. Because just as the Dutch were learning to grow pineapples at home, something even stranger was happening. People began to rent them. Yes, rent, not buy. not eat, not even own in the traditional sense. Just borrow. Pineapples became props. In this chapter of fruity absurdity, wealthy hosts, those unable to afford the thousands of guilders for their own imported or cultivated pineapple, could instead hire a fresh one for a dinner party, ent, ball, or banquet. It would be delivered likely under cloth and supervision, set on the table as the centerpiece, and later picked up again by the provider to be rented out to someone else the next night. This same pineapple might circulate among 3, 4, even 5 different households. Each guest list carefully rotated to avoid repetition. It was the edible equivalent of renting a tuxedo, if the tuxedo were made of golden thorns and tropical dreams. Some of these rental pineapples became minor celebrities in their own right. Guests would murmur that they had seen this one before at So and So's engagement feast, or that the blush on its cheeks looked a little more faded now. There's even a widely retold, if possibly apocryphal, story of a rented pineapple accidentally being sliced by an overeager servant. The hostess, upon realizing the damage, fainted clean into the soup tureen. You imagine that servant's performance review didn't go well. But this bizarre rental economy wasn't just a footnote in party planning. It reveals something deeper about the social mechanics of the time. Because in a society obsessed with appearances, the pineapple was a shortcut to relevance. A visual cue that shouted, "Look, we too are worldly. We too dine like kings." And if the fruit wasn't real, no problem. Some hosts used wax replicas, hand-painted with pigments and brushed with a little oil to catch the candlelight. Guests were not encouraged to touch. One museum even holds a wooden pineapple used as a ceremonial gift box, its hollow center once packed with sugar and dried orange peel. Historians still debate how widespread pineapple rentals actually were. Some argue they were an urban myth inflated by gossip and satire, strict codes. Others point to merchant ledgers and letters that hint at actual agreements. Fruit loaned for a fee, complete with security deposits. A few rare documents reference party fruit, which may be a euphemism, but we're choosing to take it literally. What's clear is this: by the late 1600s, the pineapple wasn't just a fruit. It was a symbol, a narrative, a kind of high society punctuation mark that ended every sentence with a flourish, and like most status symbols, it sparked copycats. This was the era of pineapple everything, embroidered onto napkins, carved into furniture, painted onto tiles. A noble family's coat of arms was even updated to include a stylized pineapple. Though, to be fair, the leaves looked more like a startled porcupine. You pass a bakery now, its windows fogged with the last warmth of the oven. Inside, a woman brushes sugar onto a small tart. The crust is golden, the filling is pear, maybe apples. Definitely not pineapple. That would be wasteful, because even as pineapple flavor slowly trickled into candies, syrups, and alcohols, the real thing remained out of reach for most people, which only made the obsession worse. Imagine being invited to a wedding where the bride wears a gown stitched with pineapple motifs. Not because she loves fruit, but because her family rented one once. And they've never stopped talking about it. Or consider pineapple toast, a ceremonial gesture where guests would raise their glasses toward the fruit before drinking, as if its mere presence conferred blessing. No actual pineapple was consumed. The fruit sat untouched, dignified, glowing faintly under beeswax candles. One satire from 1692 imagines a man leaving his entire estate to a pineapple in his well, calling it the only guest who never lied, which is a bit harsh on humans, but honestly, not entirely wrong. There were even pineapple-themed poems, largely terrible, but full of passion. One went, "Oh, though, with crown of tropic fire, they skin so rude, they scent entire. Though near I taste their golden core, to see the once, I ask no more." It's unclear whether this poem was romantic or devotional. Either way, it was definitely not about bananas. Back on the street, you pass under a wrought iron sign shaped like a pineapple, suspended over what looks like an apothecary. The door is locked for the night, but in the window, a dusty jar contains dried pineapple slices, or something close, maybe quince, maybe hope. You think about the pineapple's journey from indigenous cultivation in South America to Dutch high society, from greenhouse experiments to party rentals. Every part of its rise was tied to longing. Longing for luxury, longing for meaning, longing to be seen. And of course, longing for something that rots if you blink too slowly. The fruit didn't last. It never does. Eventually, pineapple imports became more efficient. Colonial plantations expanded. Prices dropped. And the fruit that once meant everything became edible, just a dessert. Sweet, yes, but no longer sacred. But for that brief, golden window in the Dutch Republic, it was magic. A rental. A ruse. A little thorny miracle with a passport longer than your arm. You take one more glance at that apothecary window. The jar catches the moonlight. And for a second, just a flicker, you think it winks back. Your shoes crunch faintly against the frost-glossed cobbles, because yes, there's a fine shimmer of cold across the city now. Not enough for snow, but enough to make your breath visible, curling like ribbon from your mouth. The canal beside you lies still, its surface smooth as dark silk, and just beyond the next bridge, you glimpse something unexpected, a carved stone pineapple perched atop an arched gate. More permanent than the fresh fruit. Less juicy, sure, but less perishable. You've reached the age of the architectural pineapple. By the 1700s, as the fruit itself slowly became more accessible through Caribbean trade and improved shipping, its status as a symbol had grown roots in the physical world. No longer confined to the table, the pineapple was now sprouting from rooftops, stair railings, gateposts, and fireplace mantels. It was a badge of hospitality, a gilded welcome mat that said, "We have style," tasted, and maybe even servants who've seen a pineapple in real life. Dutch townhouses, particularly in affluent neighborhoods, began incorporating pineapple reliefs into their facades, not everywhere, and not always accurately. Some of these carvings looked more like pine cones. Others, frankly, resembled spiky lemons. But the intent was there. Visitors would approach, notice the ornament, and know they were entering a space with cosmopolitan flair. But why architecture? Why carve fruit into stone and wood? Because permanence has power. Renting a pineapple was fleeting, just for the night, but a pineapple etched into the lintel of your home. That said, we have always been this fabulous. And the symbolism evolved too. The pineapple became shortened not just for luxury, but for welcome, for generosity. A way of saying, "You are safe here. We'll serve you coffee and not judge your boots," which is ironic, considering it started as an elitist trophy. Even public buildings got in on the act. A few Dutch guild halls added pineapple embellishments to their trim, usually funded by wealthy donors eager to leave a legacy. You can imagine the planning meeting. "Jan, should we go with lions?" "No. Too aggressive." "Eagles?" "Too imperial fruit." Tell me more." One Dutch colonial outpost in the East Indies even minted commemorative coins with a pineapple on one side and a ship on the other. Historians still argue whether this was meant to celebrate botanical exchange or just advertise the freshness of their trade routes. You lean against the stone gate for a moment and look up. The carved pineapple above you is weathered now, worn smooth at the edges, like a softened star. Rain and wind have taken their toll, but it's still there, still proud. And then you remember something strange. There's an entire genre of pineapple-themed funerary art. Yes, death pineapples, on several headstones, mostly from the 18th century. Occasionally earlier, there appear to be carved pineapples flanking the names of the deceased. Often, these were people who had worked in trade, horticulture, or strict codes, or shipping. Sometimes they were just wealthy merchants who really, really loved pineapples. One tomb inscription in a Dutch coastal town ends with a pineapple-shaped flourish and the words, "He fed the world, though tasted little." Poetic, slightly confusing. Both. There's even a funerary wreath, preserved in a museum in Leiden, that uses dried pineapple rings strung together with marigolds. You wonder what that smelled like. Probably tangy, and just a bit haunting. Of course, strict codes. Not everyone approved of pineapple mania creeping into every corner of daily life. Some ministers preached sermons warning against fruitful vanity. One pamphlet accused Dutch society of rotting from the crown downward, which was either a critique of tropical imports or a pun so well crafted it deserves applause. In satire and moral cartoons, pineapples were sometimes drawn as false idols, glowing temptations luring men away from simpler values. A 1723 engraving shows a merchant ignoring his sick child while polishing a pineapple centerpiece. Subtle. Yet, despite these warnings, the pineapple's grip only tightened, and not just in the Netherlands. This was the golden era of pineapple diplomacy. European embassies occasionally gifted pineapples as tokens of goodwill. One was sent to the French court with a note reading, "May this fruit reflect the warmth of our intentions." Louis XV reportedly tried to eat it in one sitting and suffered a sore tongue for a week. Meanwhile, back in the Dutch Republic, gardeners continued refining their methods. More greenhouses, more precise temperature controls. One enterprising botanist even developed a mobile pineapple cart, essentially a greenhouse on wheels, so the plant could follow the sun like a lazy cat. Pineapple cultivation became a science and an art form. Manuals were written, diagrams drawn. Some greenhouses had little glass domes built just for one plant at a time. These were called ananas copels, or pineapple domes, and yes, they looked a bit like little fruit temples. Still, most households couldn't grow their own. The climate remained tricky, and the costs, even with local methods, were sky high, so for many it remained a dream. Or a decoration. A delicately embroidered pineapple might hang over the hearth. A child might be named Anichi, in honor of the fruit, though that's probably a stretch. But the point remains, this was no passing trend. The pineapple had entered the collective imagination. You cross a bridge now, the water below silent and dark. The city's lights flicker in the reflection like distant stars. Above one doorway, you see an old wooden plaque painted with curling gold script "Welcome, Vriend," and just beside the letters, a pineapple carved in relief, slightly faded but unmistakable. The fruit of welcome, the guest of honor, the edible ambassador. And though no one rents them anymore, at least, not that we know of, the idea remains that a single fruit, placed just so, can say what words sometimes can't. Welcome, you matter. Come in and be warm. And also, please don't eat the decor. You turn a corner and step into a quieter street. Narrower, dimmer, the kind of lane where windows seem to eavesdrop. Here, the houses lean slightly inward, as if they're whispering secrets to one another. And in this hush, you arrive at something unusual, a storefront filled with ceramic pineapples. Not fruit, not real, just dozens, maybe hundreds, of painted pineapple-shaped vessels, statues, and decorative oddities. It's a shop window frozen in time. Welcome to the pineapple souvenir craze. By the mid-18th century, actual pineapple ownership was still limited, but pineapple-themed stuff was everywhere. Tableware, embroidery, hair combs, sugar spoons, candlesticks. If it could be molded, stitched, or smithed, it probably had a pineapple version. There were even pineapple ink pots, because nothing says serious correspondence like dipping your quill into a spiky fruit. This was peak pineapple kitsch. And in the Dutch Republic, this wave of consumer obsession sparked what some modern historians cheekily refer to as ananasjekt. Pineapple madness. People couldn't always get the fruit, but they could buy its image. A kind of tropical marriage available to anyone with a few guilders. Merchants leaned into the trend hard. Apothecaries began labeling elixirs as pineapple-infused, even when they absolutely weren't. Pineapple-scented wax candles hit the market. One particularly bold seller tried to market a pineapple-shaped foot warmer. It didn't sell well, but points for commitment. And let's talk fashion. Yes, pineapple embroidery on collars and cuffs became a thing. And no, it wasn't subtle. Picture a burgundy tunic with bold yellow piney apples stitched across the front. Kind of like medieval Hawaiian wear, but colder, starchier, and less breathable. Historians still argue whether this was driven by genuine admiration or social pressure. Some say people wore pineapple patterns to signal sophistication, even if they'd never seen the real fruit. Others think it was more about community identity, joining the global trade fever with style. Whatever the motive, it spread fast. One Delft workshop specialized in pineapple-shaped sugar boxes, tiny, lidded containers with gold detailing. Another produced wall tiles featuring stylized fruit framed by tulips and vines. You imagine someone in 1765 casually sipping tea beside their pineapple tile fireplace and thinking, "Yes, I've made it." The pineapple became a motif in household pride, like having a marble sink or monogrammed napkins today. It meant you were connected, worldly, aware, even if your idea of the tropics came entirely from second-hand stories and botanical drawings. And those drawings, everywhere. Scientific curiosity about the fruit led to gorgeously illustrated pineapple studies, many hand-colored and painstakingly annotated. Some botanists got so obsessed they dedicated entire treatises to ananas comosus, detailing leaf angle, fruit size, and ideal soil composition in overwrought Latin. One publication included a fold-out diagram that, when fully opened, was taller than a toddler. A favorite theory of the time, that pineapples could prevent melancholy. The shape is cheering, one writer declared, as is the golden hue. So basically 18th century mood lighting. Still, not everyone approved of this pineapple palooza. One satirical cartoon from the period shows a family bankrupting themselves to afford pineapple wallpaper. The father weeps. The mother clutches a matching pineapple teapot. Their child is dressed as a tiny fruit. The caption, "The devil wears tropics." Okay, not literally, but that's the vibe. You pause at the shop window. The ceramics are dusty now, sealed behind glass, forgotten by most. But once, these would have been prized gifts. A pineapple-shaped ink blotter might have been passed between lovers. A porcelain fruit bowl could have served as a wedding dowry. In one recorded case, a pair of pineapple salt shakers was stolen during a petty burglary. And the newspapers actually mentioned it. High drama for low spice. The pineapple's popularity also sparked some unintended consequences. With so many people desperate for authentic pineapple experiences, counterfeiters emerged. Sellers would disguise other fruits, or even hand-carved wooden models, under layers of glaze and sugar, presenting them as the real thing. One clever fraudster in The Hague used an artichoke and a generous coat of honey. Historians still debate how widespread the fakes were, or whether many buyers even noticed. After all, if you'd never seen or tasted a pineapple before, how would you know you'd been duped? Strictco, you might bite into that honeyed artichoke and think, wow, tangy and rustic. This led to the rise of pineapple testers, wealthy buyers who'd pay experts to sniff, prod, and occasionally sample the fruit on their behalf before sealing the deal. Think luxury personal shoppers, but fruitier. You can't help but smirk at the absurdity. All this fuss for a fruit. But maybe it wasn't just about the fruit. Maybe it was about the fantasy. The chance to touch something rare, to own a slice of the exotic, even if only symbolically. The pineapple, in that sense, became a vessel, not just for flavor, but for longing. You step back from the window, your reflection layered over 100 ceramic pineapples. There's something comforting about their permanence. The way they endure. Unlike the real fruit, which bruises, rots, and vanishes, these little replicas stay bright. They whisper we were wanted. And maybe, strict codes, somewhere inside that painted glaze and faint museum dust, you hear echoes of 1,000 whispered conversations. Did you see their pineapple tiles? I heard they served pineapple liqueur at the christening. My cousin stitched one onto her apron! Moments of envy, pride, and a dash of tropical daydreaming, preserved in clay and color. Now, as you continue your walk, you imagine a parallel world not so far from ours, one where obsession flickers just beneath the surface, where objects carry dreams, and where a spiky yellow fruit once ruled not just the table, but the imagination of a nation. You follow a canal now, its surface glossy and dark, catching reflections of lanterns swinging from distant windows. A soft wind pushes the scent of damp brick and peat smoke. You're headed to a very special corner of this history, where pineapples weren't bought or borrowed or baked into tarts. They were grown. In the Netherlands. In the snow. Yes, welcome to the Dutch pineapple greenhouse. At first, this seems impossible. Northern Europe isn't exactly known for its balmy climate. Winters here turn cobblestones to ice and wine mills into frozen sculptures. But the Dutch, practical and innovative, were not easily deterred. And when aristocrats wanted pineapples grown at home, gardeners got to work. These early Glashuizen were called Ananashuizen, pineapple houses. They were elaborate, expensive, and slightly ridiculous. Built of brick and framed with small, curved glass panes, they often sloped to face the sun, maximizing any sliver of warmth. Inside, layers of rotting manure, decomposing straw, and peat created artificial heat beds. Yes, the secret to growing pineapples in Holland. Hot poop. This was horticultural theatre. Gardeners managed humidity with damp cloths. They tracked sunlight with mirrors. They fluffed the manure piles daily to maintain heat. Strict codes. It was like keeping a tropical diva alive during an Arctic tour. One estate, belonging to the wealthy Van Heemskerk family, boasted a pineapple conservatory with 15 fruiting plants. They held a garden party when the first one ripened. The pineapple was brought out on a velvet cushion. Guests applauded. Someone fainted. A harp was involved. This wasn't farming, it was spectacle. And let's talk cost. Growing a single pineapple might take 2 to 3 years and the equivalent of thousands of euros in today's money. Some noble families would grow just one, strict codes, then rent it out for months before finally eating it. It was more profitable to tour the pineapple than consume it. Historians still argue whether these estate-grown pineapples were viable long-term, or just vanity projects. Some claim a few Dutch estates maintained their pineapple greenhouses for decades. Others suggest it was all a brief trend, like powdered wigs or pet raccoons. Still, the ambition was real. Dutch botanists kept meticulous journals tracking leaf angles, soil pH, temperature shifts. They wrote about pineapple growth the way some people write love letters. One entry from 1768 reads, Day 1212. Slight yellowing at crown. Aroma promising. Heat bed replenished with 3 barrels of horse doing. Romantic, no. There's even a curious crossover here with colonial science. Dutch traders, especially those linked to the East and West India companies, brought back growing tips from tropical regions. Some accurate, others less so. One theory held that pineapples grew better if they heard music. A wealthy gentleman in Haarlem hired a lute player to strum softly for his greenhouse. The experiment ended in frostbite and disappointment, but not before the lute player composed an entire pineapple sonata. Another method involved whispering to the fruit. Encouragement, they believed, improved sweetness. This idea didn't survive peer review. Still, you can't help but admire the effort. In a way, these pineapple greenhouses were laboratories. Early experiments in climate control, crop forcing, and precision gardening. They pushed horticulture forward by accident. But not everyone was impressed. Pamphlets from the period satirized the mania. One anonymous broadside warns readers about the tyrannical rule of the ananas, which emptieth wallets and occupieth the minds of good men. Another shows a caricature of a nobleman kissing a pineapple while his wife weeps beside a dry firewood stack. Some saw these projects as wasteful distractions, particularly in times of economic strain. Why grow a pineapple in Haarlem when you could plant potatoes in Friesland? Yet the pineapple endured. In a curious twist, some estate owners began commissioning painted pineapple panels to hang outside their greenhouses, essentially signs boasting, "Yes, we grow these here." One such panel, still preserved in a Dutch archive, reads, with care and patience, "The south doth yield to the north." It's a motto that feels oddly modern. You peer through an iron gate now and spot a crumbling glasshouse overtaken by ivy. It's the ghost of a pineapple house. Long abandoned, its bricks chipped, its frame bent by storms. But in the moonlight, it still holds shape, like a fossil of ambition. Inside, you imagine the air once thick with steam and sap. A gardener, half botanist, half magician, sweating over a mound of straw and soil, coaxing colour from stubborn green. Maybe he hummed to the plant. Maybe he cursed it. Maybe he just dreamed of tasting it. Pineapple growing became such a status symbol that the greenhouses themselves were sometimes replicated in miniature. Tiny glass dioramas shown to guests like dollhouses for fruit. Some were mechanical. Turn a crank, and the pineapple model slowly ripened under painted sunbeams. It was gardening, but with a clockmaker's flair. You find yourself wondering what drove this need. Historians suggest it was partly about power, the desire to control nature, to command the exotic. If the tropics wouldn't come to the Netherlands, the Dutch would build them. Brick by brick, pane by pane. Or perhaps it was hope. Because what is a greenhouse if not a dream with a roof? A declaration that something fragile can survive where it shouldn't. You stand for a while in that overground place, listening to the wind whistle through cracked glass. You picture the moment of triumph, a fruit, finely yellow, glinting in candlelight, filling the air with sweetness and soil. All that work, all that waiting, just to hold a miracle. You leave the abandoned greenhouse behind and walk along a narrow brick lane, slick with dew. The moon hangs heavy above the canal, and somewhere nearby, a duck snorts in its sleep. Your mind is still full of warm manure and whispering to fruit, but now you're drifting toward a quieter, stranger chapter of this pineapple obsession, one that didn't involve growing at all. This was the age of pineapple fakes. That's right. For those who couldn't afford the real thing, or couldn't wait years for one to ripen. There was another option: commission and imitation. Pineapple replicas became their own microeconomy in 17th century Dutch society. And we're not talking cartoonish fruit-shaped pillows or plastic kitchen decor. These were serious art objects. Craftsmen, ceramicists, woodcarvers, and wax molders were hired to make hyper-realistic pineapples from clay, papierm's chin, even glazed sugar. Some were painted with obsessive detail. Others were hollowed out so you could hide smaller, less glamorous fruit inside during a dinner reveal. Oh look, a pineapple! Except it's full of boiled apples. You can practically hear the disappointed chewing. Why fake it? Well, you had to keep up appearances. Imagine hosting a merchant banquet, no pineapple on the table. Your guests would sip their ale, glance meaningfully at your lack of tropical fruit, and make mental notes about your dwindling influence. Reputation was everything, and yes, people rented fake pineapples too. Some vendors offered both real and replica pineapples for hire, conveniently labeled for display only, or not for slicing. You could even pay extra to have your fax pineapple dusted with a bit of imported cinnamon to give it that spicy island aroma. Historians still argue whether some people knew they were being tricked. Was it all part of the theatre? A shared joke? Or did some guests genuinely believe the pristine fruit on the table was fresh from Suriname? Records show that one Amsterdam merchant was caught passing off a wax pineapple as real. The scandal made it into the town gossip sheets, where he was mockingly called the Sugar Baron of Rotterdam, and was gifted, anonymously, a basket of turnips carved to resemble exotic melons. The message was clear: we see you. But there were also more innocent versions of the pineapple fake. Some households had permanent fruit arrangements on display, often sealed in glass domes. These were cabinet curiosities, part natural history, part social climbing. A lifelike wax pineapple next to a preserved hummingbird. You were signaling that you travelled, or at least traded with those who did. These displays often lived in the vouwhuis, the front room used for receiving guests. You'd sit beneath a painting of a naval battle, drink thin wine from a blue Delft goblet, and politely admire the owner's pineapple-shaped candle holder. Yes, those existed too. Pineapple-shaped snuff boxes, doorknobs, inkwells. There's even a surviving chamber pot from The Hague shaped like a pineapple. Its original owner must have had complicated feelings about the fruit. One of the more delightful fringe tidbits from this time is the story of the pineapple mimic artist. A minor painter named Cornelis van der Boom who specialized in still lifes that included fruits he had never actually seen. Rumor has it he based his pineapples on descriptions from travel logs and second-hand sketches. The result, a generation of Dutch paintings that show pineapples with suspiciously smooth skin and leaves like artichokes. The accuracy didn't matter. The symbol did. In fact, the popularity of pineapple imagery sparked something akin to brand dilution. Much like a logo that shows up everywhere. On sweatshirts, coffee mugs, questionable tattoos, the more the pineapple appeared, the more disconnected it became from the real, tart, juicy thing. And yet, the fruit's magic endured. Some theologians even got involved, writing metaphorical interpretations of the pineapple. One 17th century pamphlet titled The Heavenly Fruit described the pineapple as a lesson in patience and discipline, because it doth not yield fruit but by long waiting, and the reward is sweet to those who endure. Others weren't so poetic. One disgruntled scholar compared the obsession with pineapples to the Tower of Babel, a vain attempt to mimic the heavens with earthly ambition. That man had never tasted a piga colada. Clearly, but even among skeptics, the pineapple remained a reliable stand-in for wealth, success, and worldly access. To have one, even a fake one, was to tell a story. It's saying, I am connected, I am current, I can get my hands on something rare. You pass now by a darkened window, and in the glass you catch your reflection alongside a faint image of a carved wooden fruit. Maybe once part of a dining set, now forgotten in an attic. It's chipped, dusty, but still recognizable, still clinging to its story. One fun fact, pineapple substitutes didn't stop in the 1600s. Even in the 19th century, British and Dutch households were still placing imitation pineapples on their mantels. In fact, a few Victorian etiquette guides explicitly state, if a real pineapple cannot be obtained, a substitute of fair quality may suffice, so long as the guest is not expected to taste it. You chuckle. Centuries of fruit fraud and the social anxiety remains. Maybe the most telling piece of pineapple theatre was this, occasionally. Hosts would borrow a real pineapple just for the party, place it on the table untouched, then return it the next day, sometimes with a small fee for aroma loss. One account describes a young maid being sent to fetch the pineapple before dessert, only to return weeping. It was gone, she said. Taken from the window by a passerby. The party ended early. The hostess fainted. The pineapple was never recovered. Some suspect it was eaten by a group of dockworkers who, rumor claims, boiled it and served it with salted pork. Probably not the experience the hostess envisioned. So yes, fakes, rentals, ceramic forgeries, even a pineapple-shaped inkwell or two. In the grand theatre of the Dutch Golden Age, the pineapple played many parts, sometimes ripe, sometimes real, sometimes pure wax and bravado, but always the star. The fog lifts gently as you walk on, the air thick with chimney smoke and damp straw. A dog barks in the distance, maybe a merchant's hound, maybe just a bored soul up too late. You've now wandered through orchards, greenhouses, wax museums of fruit, and even a few dinner parties featuring edible deception. But this next stretch, it's about where the pineapple landed after the Golden Age. Because of course, no trend, no matter how sweet or spiky, lasts forever. By the early 1700s, the Dutch pineapple craze began to wane. New trade routes were forming. The British, French, and Spanish were establishing their own tropical colonies. Suddenly, you didn't need a West India Company ledger the size of a shipping crate just to get your hands on a pineapple. They were still rare, sure, but less so. The fruit went from being a whisper of status to a slightly louder murmur. In some circles, that made it less desirable. If everyone could have one, what was the point? And yet, the legacy of that obsession refused to disappear quietly. Some Amsterdam households started treating pineapples like heirlooms. Yes, even the wax ones. They were passed down, cleaned carefully, stored in cloth-lined boxes like sacred relics of a more exotic time. One family reportedly displayed theirs every Christmas, perched atop a lace, duly like a porcelain nativity scene, minus the shepherds. Others turned their pineapples into keepsake art. There's a surviving example of a dried and lacquered pineapple that was framed in gold and hung above a fireplace with the inscription, "Bought, not grown, admired by all, eaten by none." Now that's a family motto, but something stranger also started happening. As pineapples became less rare, they became more metaphorical. They began showing up in places that had nothing to do with food, carved into furniture, painted on wallpaper, etched into gateposts. The pineapple became a motif, a symbol of hospitality, welcome, and just a touch of opulence. In fact, if you've ever noticed a pineapple carved above an old European doorway or stitched into a tapestry, that's probably where it started. This idea that the pineapple said, "I'm wealthy enough to own one, but gracious enough to share it," which, let's be honest, is a pretty elite way of saying, "Come on in." Historians still argue whether this symbolism was intentional or simply a design trend that spiraled out of control. Was it a cultural shorthand for tropical trade routes, or just a convenient shape to carve that didn't look like yet another acanthus leaf? Whatever the case, it stuck, and the Dutch helped it spread. As Dutch artisans moved across Europe, especially into parts of Germany, England, and Scandinavia, they brought their pineapple love with them. The carving techniques, the color palettes, even the scented wax recipes traveled. You could find Dutch-style pineapple engravings on English oak chairs and even a few French brooches shaped like pineapples in miniature. And yes, of course someone made a pineapple-shaped perfume bottle. Smelled like ambergris and envy. One wonderfully odd fringe facting in the early 18th century, a Dutch tavern in Bruges had a pineapple sign above the door that actually lit up. Not electrically, obviously. It was done with tiny candles and then vellum panels painted to glow when backlit. Locals reportedly called it the fiery fruit, and some believed it protected the tavern from bad luck, or at least from bland stew. But as pineapples went from exotic to everyday, the wealthy elite had to find new ways to signal their status. Enter the pineapple protocol. Strict right. Manners evolved to match the fruit. One etiquette guide from the 1720s warned hosts against the vulgar display of pineapple excess. It advised only serving the fruit when accompanied by proper music, suitable glassware, and at least 2 guests who have traveled abroad. Pineapples were apparently too powerful to be eaten alone, and if you were a guest, you were expected to comment on the pineapple, but not too eagerly. Gushing over it implied you'd never seen one before, which marked you as provincial. But ignoring it entirely risked offending your host. It was like balancing a social tightrope made of twine, sugar, and passive aggression. You pass beneath an arched garden wall now, ivy creeping across the stone. Someone once carved a pineapple into the keystone, its weather-worn, softened by rain but still distinct. A ghost of status, a memory in fruit form. But back then, the pineapple's shadow stretched farther than just art and manners. Some people tried to commercialize the symbol. Pineapple-themed beauty products, home remedies, even a bizarre tonic called Anana's Elixir, claimed to cure melancholy and lighten the humors. It probably just tasted like fermented syrup and regret. The Dutch colonial connection also meant that pineapple-based products were sometimes linked, awkwardly, to empire. Ads promised the taste of Suriname in your cupboard, without quite mentioning who had to pick the fruit. This part of the story gets murkier, and modern historians continue to wrestle with the uncomfortable links between fruit obsession and exploitation. But for most ordinary Dutch citizens, the pineapple's journey was less about politics and more about dream space. It represented a time when ambition could be sweet, status could be tasted, and a single fruit could make or break your social season. And thing it didn't. As pineapples became more common, and eventually just another grocery item, the Golden Age obsession faded like a cresting wave. By the late 1700s, only a few pineapple-specific greenhouses remained in the Netherlands, and the wax replicas gathered dust in forgotten corners of merchant homes. Still, echoes of the obsession lingered. A few Dutch poets wrote laments to the pineapple. Yes, actual poems. One ends with the line, "It pricks, it rots, it dazzles, then dies. But how it watched us rise." You stop now beneath a tall pine, the wind swaying through its branches like an old rhythm. Somewhere back in the winding alleys of Amsterdam, a wax fruit sits in a museum case, labelled Simplig Pineapple, ca. 1660, owner unknown. But maybe the owner isn't unknown. Maybe it's every dreamer who ever wished to hold a little slice of paradise, even if it had to be rented. You press on, steps slower now, as the night stretches around you like soft fabric. There's a last thread to pull, and it lies not in the fruit itself, but in what the obsession left behind. Because here's the twist: long after the Dutch stopped renting pineapples, the idea of them, what they symbolized, took on a life of its own. The Golden Age had its gilded fruit, but what lingered was something almost more powerful, the performance of desire. Centuries later, Dutch museums, especially in Amsterdam and The Hague, began cataloguing items from the height of the pineapple craze. But what they found was peculiar, not crates of rotting fruit, thank goodness, but sketches, bills of sale, diary entries, wax replicas, even miniature pineapple-shaped lockets, tiny tokens that suggested the fruit had become more memory than meal. And memories are easier to preserve. One museum curator described the pineapple artifacts as emotional fossils, fragments of a cultural mood, that longing for tropical perfection, that sweet sting of unreachable luxury. Like framing a concert ticket or keeping a dried corsage, you can't eat a pineapple from 1662, but you can still feel what it meant. The pineapple even made its way into Dutch lullabies. Yep. At least one surviving children's rhyme includes a line about a golden fruit from sea, far lands, followed by a nonsensical verse about sharing it with the moon. Sleepy poetry with a juicy past. And that brings us, rather poetically, to how the Dutch Golden Age pineapple became a bedtime story. Because when you think about it, strict codes, this whole obsession reads like a fairy tale. There's mystery, there's magic, there's a cursed treasure you're not allowed to bite, a wax fruit that costs more than a horse, a greenhouse that takes 6 men to maintain a single snack. And there's you, still wandering this tale, watching the candlelight of the past flicker against the velvet night. The Dutch may have been practical merchants, brilliant seafarers, and ruthless colonial power brokers, but deep down they were dreamers too. Dreamers who looked at a spiky, weird fruit and saw a golden flame of status, a crown-shaped promise that if you worked hard enough, earned enough, hosted cleverly enough, you too could place paradise on a plate. Historians still debate how serious the pineapple market truly got. Were there underground rental rings, secret auction houses, black market pineapple fakes? Probably not. But then again, it's hard to document something no one was proud of. Who wants to admit they spent a year's wages borrowing fruit? That's the fringe fact we'll leave with. A few noble families kept detailed pineapple ledgers. Not for trade, but for tracking who borrowed which replica, when and under what conditions. Think of it like a fruit library. One record even notes a fine for returning a wax pineapple with smudge upon the base. You don't want to anger the fruit librarian. And so, the legacy lives on, not just in carvings or curious museum labels, but in our cultural muscle memory. Even today, the pineapple remains a symbol of welcome, of feast, of aspirational hospitality. You see it on door knockers, cocktail napkins, and airbean pillows embroidered with live, laugh. Pineapple, a fruit that once cost more than a month's rent, now flavoring the water in your gin bottle. You walk a little farther, then pause beneath a star-spilled sky. Imagine holding a quipu in one hand and a pineapple in the other. One the language of memory, the other the currency of desire. Both fragile, both misunderstood. Proof that humans, in every age, need symbols to chase and stories to tell. Which is, of course, where you come in. Because maybe tonight's story isn't just about Dutch merchants or wax fruit or spicy shipping manifests. Maybe it's about you. Lying there, eyelids heavy, drifting through the warm tide of detail and laughter, thinking just maybe you'd like to rent a pineapple someday. Not to impress anyone. Not to post about it. Just to hold a dream that once made Europe stop and stare. The air is cooler now, brushing against your cheeks like a closing curtain. In the far distance, a bell chimes, not from a church, but from memory. You smile, because in this story, you didn't just hear history, you touched it. You wandered through it, you tasted it, even if just in imagination, and now the walk is done. So, you're still here, quiet now, tucked in, thoughts full of fruit and candlelight and centuries, folded like maps. Let's slow it all down. The night has settled fully, and the last embers of story glow soft in the hearth of your mind. That bustling Dutch port, those absurdly delicate wax replicas, the warm greenhouse air, all of it starts to blur into a gentle rhythm. A lullaby of long-lost cravings. The air grows heavier in the best way, like a thick, woolen blanket drawn over your shoulders. Your body loosens, breathing evens. Maybe your fingers twitch with the memory of silk gloves or crinkled paper invitations. Maybe you're still imagining a pineapple on a silver tray, turning slowly in the candlelight, impossibly bright. Let it all drift now. You've wandered far tonight, through fog, firelight, and antique absurdities, through knotted data and fruit-shaped hope, all to arrive here, this quiet place, this soft, slow breath. Whatever your day was, whatever tomorrow asks, none of that matters now. Because here in the folds of sleep, in the strange little corner where pineapples were once priceless, you've found a pause, a whisper of gold. So let your thoughts scatter like spice on warm wind. Strict codes, let the wax fruit fade behind velvet ropes, and let yourself just rest.